Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. My guest today is Mr. John Sipher from Washington, D.C. He's a former operative officer of the CIA, and he is also an expert in Eastern Europe, specifically the Balkans and Russia. Thanks for joining me today, John. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure. Nice to be here.
Well, first of all, would you like to tell my viewers something about your background in Eastern Europe and why we called you an expert? Because the object of this interview will be the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, I think it's very important to set the point straight about your background.
Sure. And I actually don't like being called an expert because in the CIA, in the clandestine service, we were actually pretty much generalists. We sort of specialized in some issues, but we worked and lived in a variety of places. So I've lived in Asia and Southeast Asia and in Europe and Russia and in a variety of places. But I probably did spend most of my time focused on when it was the Soviet Union and then Russia. So I spent 28 years in the clandestine service of the Central Intelligence Agency. That's the part of the organization that runs spy networks and collects information to be given to professional analysts to hopefully help our policymakers make better policy. And I retired in 2014. I lived in a variety of places, some which I'm not supposed to say, but in the Balkans during the Balkan Wars, and I was in Russia. And then I worked in places at Southeast Asia and South Asia, working on terrorism issues the later part of my career.
Okay, great. Well, let's get to the main topic of this discussion we're having. Why did this war start in the first place? Because Putin says that Russia wants to remove the Nazis from Ukraine, but is Ukraine government really made of Nazis, or is it all in Putin's mind?
That could either get a very short answer or a long answer, but the short answer is, of course, it's not made of Nazis. Russian disinformation from the Soviet days till present day often takes a small grain of truth and twists it in such a way to try to create a false narrative. And so, historically in the Soviet Union, there were, in World War II, there were Ukrainian nationalists, some who worked with the Germans when they invaded because they didn't want to be under Soviet control. And then, since that time, there's been people who've, taken far right-wing views in Ukraine because they saw themselves as anti-Soviet or anti-Russian. But that's a small portion of the country. The country is a democratic country. It has a Jewish president. And so this is just, a false narrative, disinformation that Vladimir Putin uses to sort of try to justify his actions to people who really aren't paying attention and don't know much about this. But to get back to your bigger question, why did this happen? It's unfortunate. It really is the doings and based on the viewpoints of a single man, Vladimir Putin. So you have a guy who is a former KGB officer who's had long held grievances against the West in a view that the West has humiliated Russia. And, over time, 20 years in power, he's become increasingly sort of driven by these views of, greater Russia and anti-Western views. And he's created this sort of mythology that, Russia needs to continue to expand, and a greater Russia needs to include all the places where there's ethnic Russian speakers, and the fall of the Soviet Union and some of the key countries that left the Soviet Union, Belarus and Ukraine and others, should be under Moscow's control, if not, vassals or under direct control. And so he created a false narrative to justify this. There was no threat from Ukraine to Russia. Ukraine doesn't even have the military set up to invade a country like Russia. He claimed that it was because of, NATO expansion, but NATO hasn't expanded in, 12 years, and most countries, NATO didn't expand. Countries wanted to join NATO because they were worried about Russian expansion. And so there's a variety of things that come together to include, mistakes by the West, misreading Putin, maybe accommodating him when we should have been tougher on him. So there's a variety of things that we can talk about as we move forward. But the most important thing to know is this was a completely manufactured crisis. Putin has manufactured crises in the past to try to get concessions. He would create a crisis and then have people come to him to give him concessions to de-escalate the crisis. But in this case, he rolled the dice and took a step that I think most sensible people would have thought was crazy. So he manufactured this entire crisis, and invaded a country on his border. And now we're seeing maybe the biggest threat to European security and stability in at least our generation.
So NATO is not threatening Russia. This is all in Putin's mind. We're not closer to a situation like what happened in the 60s with Cuba wanting to join the Soviets and posing a threat to the United States. I mean, NATO is not posing any threat to Russia right now.
Well, it is true that Vladimir Putin has long been against NATO. He wants the US out of Europe. He doesn't want a strong defensive alliance on his borders because it, threatens from him doing what he wants to do. And so there's sort of two views. There's one that's sort of a false view that's in his head that NATO is some sort of threat to him when it's essentially a defensive alliance. And as of last year, had very few even Americans or American troops in Europe for NATO. It's been an alliance that, countries that left the Warsaw Pact and left the Soviet Union wanted to be part of because they fear sort of the long history of Russian expansionism and Russian czars, communist bosses, and Russian leaders looking to, snuff out their independence. And so to Russian eyes, you can see it as something that makes you angry. You don't want an alliance that is sort of put together to protect against your aggression next door. But it also, in reality, was no threat to Vladimir Putin.
I think that at the beginning, Putin was planning a very quick war, but this is not what's going on. This has been going on for 1.5 months now, and they look to be stuck because they are making massacres in some cities, but they're not going forward. They're not going to overthrow the government because they just can't make it. So what do you think can be a possible ending of this war? Can Putin just go home with nothing in his hands?
No, I don't think he can. He's put together this sort of aura of a strong man, of somebody who, built a narrative about himself that, the problem that the Soviet Union fell is because when the state needed to use its brutality and be strong, it wasn't strong enough. And in his view, the weak are beaten, therefore the state can never be weak. And as long as I'm president, it'll never be weak. And so, he's taken actions over the last 20 years to show that, he's willing to use violence. He's willing to threaten and escalate tensions to get his way. And he's created this sort of strongman view of himself. And so backing down or being seen to back down is a threat to his potential leadership. And so, yeah, where does it go? That's a really good question. Yes, I think he tremendously miscalculated by going in. I think he believed that his military had been modernized and could in a couple of days take over Kiev and put in a puppet government. I think there's a variety of reasons why it didn't and couldn't. I think he misunderstood and misrepresented, Ukraine's desire for nationhood. I think he believed that his military was better than it was. But of course, his government is sort of built on corruption. It's built on kleptocracy. It's built on a large group of people around him stealing money from the state to enrich themselves. And so you can imagine any military contract for tires for vehicles or for new armor for tanks, every person in that chain has to steal some money for themselves so they can buy their yachts. And so contracts and things don't go to the best and brightest. They go to the people with the best connections to the Kremlin. So it's not a surprise that the military was not as effective as he hoped and thought it would be. Dictators over, millennia have often gotten poor information because, people understand what the dictator has in mind, what he wants to hear. And so people aren't likely to go up to the dictator and tell him the opposite or tell him that he's wrong, because they often end up in jail or dead. And so there's a variety of things that sort of work together here to make this a tremendous miscalculation and mistake, and a bloody and murderous one at that.
Well, at the moment, there are sanctions against Russia, which actually are doing something. So Russia is now in a bad situation, the population itself. How realistic is the scenario of an internal revolt against Putin to make him fall?
That's a great question, and that's the hardest question. He has built up a system. He's a career KGB officer. All of the people around him that have the most power and are closest to him are often also career power ministry or KGB officers, and they've built a system to protect themselves. They've built a system that, you know, should be coup-proof. He's built whole institutions, a national guard whose job is to essentially to watch over and protect against other institutions, so that, you know, in many ways there's people inside the military to make sure the military is loyal. There's people in other institutions that are reporting to the Kremlin. And so he's built this system to protect himself. Now, we've also seen, again, over history, that tyrants and dictators and others who are in an incredibly powerful position seem immovable until they're not. So what you see is, you know, Russia in the system looks to be quite strong. It would be wrong for anybody to suggest that there's open fissures or there's problems or there's people who are ready to kill Putin or to overthrow him. There's no opposition. He's killed off any political opposition. There's no place for anybody who has interest in working against the Kremlin to go. There's no obvious parties, groups, organizations, or anything. And so what you have is a traditional dictatorship, incredibly powerful, uses oppression and repression to keep sort of the population down, and works, you know, people around them to sort of keep them to be not threats. And so oftentimes from the outside, we don't see the small cracks that start coming. And so it's like a big, strong tree, or, you know, or a giant boulder. You hit it with a hammer and nothing happens the first 5,000 times. And then all of a sudden a crack goes and it breaks apart immediately. So this is the kind of thing, you know, there's no expert, there's nobody who understands Russia that can say with any kind of knowledge that, yes, you know, there's a group here, a group there that's a threat to Vladimir Putin, and he could be out of power anytime soon. But again, dictators, you know, often find themselves out of power, you know, the day after thinking they are in complete control.
So we'll never know in advance if that happens. But
yeah, that's the problem. And you know, the one thing is, you know, there was just a recent Levada poll in Russia. You know, of course, polling is hard in Russia because it's against the law to criticize the regime. It's against the law to even use the word war. You can go to jail for 15 years. And so it's not likely that people are going to give, you know, true opinions to a poll. But nonetheless, the poll suggests that Vladimir Putin's popularity went up drastically after the war. So there's, you know, they've been fed lies and disinformation for the last 20 years. They've been fed, you know, these threats from the West. Everything, every economic problem, every problem they have is meant to be from the CIA or the West, or in homosexuals or whatever, you know, Western values, whatever it is somebody to blame for, you know, their own problems. And so it's not surprising that there would be these sort of views out there. But over time, if there's anybody who's been screwed more by this war than the Ukrainian people, it's the Russian people. Russia's people now are seen as pariahs around the world. You know, it's difficult for them to travel. When they do travel, they're seen as, you know, supporting a monstrous regime. The economy is, you know, because of the sanctions that you mentioned, is going to take hits and is in a terrible position, maybe going back, you know, 10, 20, 30 years. You know, Western companies on their own volition have pulled out. And so, you know, they become sort of a vassal of China. And so the Russian people are, you know, over time going to realize that, you know, based on one man's decision, their futures are really have been thrown to the wind. And therefore, you know, over time, it is possible that there could become some sort of support realizing that Vladimir Putin is not the best option for the future of Russia.
Well, definitely. Well, being you an intelligence expert, I would like you to comment on something. How come Putin underrated Ukraine's reaction like that? Was that an intelligence failure?
That's a great question. I think there's a variety of answers. You know, one is, like I said, you know, dictators often, you know, don't get real information. He obviously had this sort of messianic view of great Russia and small, weak Ukraine. And he's created this sort of view in his head, and therefore the people around him understand that they need to reinforce that view rather than challenge that view. Their system is created in the intelligence side. As you know, they have the big KGB, when the Soviet Union broke into several different organizations. So you have a foreign intelligence service, which is the SVR. You have a domestic intelligence service that sort of keeps leadership and power at all costs, which is called the FSB. It has a military intelligence service. It has technical intelligence and these other things. Now, interestingly, much of the intelligence from countries like Ukraine in the near part close to Russia are run by the FSB, not by the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR. And so I think there's an arrogance there among the Russians that they think because they speak the language and that they are superior to Ukrainian people, that they understand it better and that they, can easily just sort of bully Ukrainians into doing whatever they want. And so I do think it's an intelligence failure in the sense that they very, very strongly misread the strong desire for Ukrainian nationhood. And I think if Vladimir Putin wanted to destroy Ukrainian nationhood, he's done just the opposite. This is going to be in Ukrainian history books for decades to come. There's going to be heroes that Ukrainian people talk about from this war. He has created a Ukraine, an anti-Russian Ukraine that's going to exist, for our lifetimes and much further on based on these actions. And also these actions, he wanted the US out of Europe. He wanted a weak NATO. He's reinforced, he's strengthened NATO. Countries like yours and Germany and Switzerland, and now even neutral countries like Finland and Sweden are talking about joining NATO. NATO has a purpose now like it hasn't had in decades. And the United States is more invested in Europe than it has been even in the beginning of the Biden administration. The Biden administration wanted to focus on China. They wanted to focus on Asian issues and move away from and treat Russia, in a stable and predictable relationship, it said, which was foolhardy, but that's what they wanted to do. So Vladimir Putin essentially has thrown the dice, and he's gone against all of those desires. He's hurt the Russian people. He's made for a very anti-Russian and probably more stronger in the future of Ukraine. And he's got NATO and the Americans working together better than we have in a long time.
Well, with Russia, we also have this group of guys called the oligarchs. So I would like to understand how come Russia have these people. It's pretty unique because you don't hear about oligarchs in any other country. Who are these people in the first place?
So there's three sort of key periods, I think, to understand this, what we call oligarchs. So when the Soviet Union fell, as you know, it was a communist system. Communist leaders led a pretty good life and had power in the system, but there wasn't, incredible wealth and riches like we see in China or in Russia nowadays. And when the Soviet Union fell, there was really very little expertise or experience on how you create a capitalist and Western-leaning country out of a communist system. And there was a variety of things that they tried to do to sort of move quickly towards a capitalist system. And one of the things that they did is they gave vouchers, essentially ability for average people to invest in Russian companies as they became private, massive oil companies and aluminum companies and all these massive sort of Soviet weapons companies and others. And there was a group of people who were a little bit more savvy in the system, and they understood how to take advantage of that system. And they essentially bought up vouchers from average people and took over large swaths of these massive Russian, enterprises and companies, and became very, very rich very, very quickly. So, by just having some of these vouchers and being someone who had some ability in this area, there were people who, with very little money were able to take over large control of these massive oil companies and others. And they became quite rich and quite sort of politically powerful in the Yeltsin regime in the 1990s. And so Yeltsin, I think, relied on sort of the wealth and these oligarchs. They had some sort of political power in that system. Now, Vladimir Putin at this time had retired from the KGB. He was in St. Petersburg, with former Leningrad. And, the KGB, in some ways, the story of Vladimir Putin in the 21st century is that the KGB was one of the few institutions that really sort of stayed together after the fall of the Soviet Union. They managed the Communist Party's money abroad. They understood how the smuggling networks worked. They wanted to keep their intelligence networks going. They had lived in the West and they had some experience with how to operate in these systems. And so as Yeltsin, became more and more drunk and the system became more and more unstable, Vladimir Putin and sort of his KGB cronies realized it was their time to sort of take power and control things. And Yeltsin trusted Vladimir Putin, and Putin was seen as sort of a professional. He put him in charge of the FSB, the Internal Security Service. And when Yeltsin decided to step out of power, he moved Putin into the prime ministership and then to take over from him president when he stepped down. Because essentially, while he was in that position of the FSB, this Internal Security Service, Putin protected Yeltsin, protected the Yeltsin family. There was a lot of efforts to go after the Yeltsin family and people around him for stealing money and taking illegal actions and these kind of stuff. And Vladimir Putin protected him. He then became president, and very soon after started to take control. He took control of the media, but the most important thing he did in the first few years of his presidency was he took control of the oligarchy. He brought the oligarchs under state control, under the Kremlin. And one of the main ways he did that is he arrested Khodorkovsky, who is the richest man in Russia, controlled, the Yukos oil concern. By far the richest man in Russia, quite powerful, had some political aspirations. And Yeltsin had him arrested, thrown in prison for 10 years, and essentially called in all of these other wealthy oligarchs, many who stayed in Russia, many who'd gone abroad, and said, I will allow you to stay rich as long as you stay out of politics and you do the bidding of the Kremlin when needed. And this is a long history in part of Russian history. This is the czars used the boyars this way. When it was time for the czars to make war, they would go to the nobles, the rich nobles, the boyars, and ask them for money and people to fund their wars. And so essentially Putin took over the oligarchs. So that's the first phase, was the Yeltsin period, where they were rich and politically powerful. The second phase is where they became under the control of the Kremlin, and therefore them being rich was important, that they stayed close to the Kremlin. If you went against the Kremlin, he would make sure that all your money was gone. You either went to jail or they found a way to undercut you.
Well, you already said something about the role of fake news propaganda, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit on what's the role of fake news propaganda right now during the war, because we see every day that the Russians destroy cities, they make massacres, and then on TV, they blame it on Ukrainians. So what is going on here?
Yeah, so that's always been throughout the Soviet period. Disinformation was one of the tools of the intelligence service. It was to keep their enemies, off balance. And we saw in the 2016 in the United States, right? So they were involved in spreading false information, weaponizing social media, engaging in sort of the use of disinformation. But it always had both a domestic and an international phase to it. So disinformation and false information was used very, very widely inside Russia. It is in the Kremlin's interest to have a public who either is not political, is either apathetic or not political. And one of the reasons, if you drub people constantly with false information and people get to the point where they don't know what's true, what's not true, they just sort of step back from politics and stay out of it. And that's to the Kremlin's interest. Then they have a apathetic public and they can continue to do what they want to do for their own purposes to keep themselves in power and keep themselves rich. So that's a domestic piece. And then overseas, they've used it on every possible thing. It's almost become instinct. We just saw these horrible war crimes north of Kiev, and it's clear what the Russian troops had done, essentially murdering civilians. Within the next day, the Russians are saying, oh, it's fake, it's staged, it's a provocation. They even went to the UN and said, we need to do an investigation, have a UN meeting about how the Ukrainians have killed their own people and have faked these things to try to make the Russians look bad. So this is just part of the Russian and the Kremlin playbook. And it's ugly, but it's been effective for them to keep people off balance and keep their own people sort of out of politics.
In your opinion, do older generations and younger generations fall fake news at the same way, or are younger more shielded? I don't know.
That's a good question. I think people are getting more savvy about how disinformation flows through social media and some of these things. Countries close to Russia, the Baltic countries, the Nordic countries, Poland, Ukraine, and others who've been bombarded with this for years understand it better and defend themselves better against it. And in fact, I think some of Ukraine's success in this war is because they've been hit with this stuff for at least the last 8 years since the Russians went into the Donbass and Crimea. The Russians have been just on this sort of massive effort to spread, to destabilize and spread disinformation in Ukraine, so that when the war actually came, Ukraine was ready for it. There was, it didn't sort of knock them off their game. They understood how this was. In fact, since they speak the language, they understand it well enough, they could turn some of it back against them. And so Ukraine's been very good about communicating what's happening to the West, but also trolling and messing with the Kremlin and not falling for Kremlin false information. And so, in terms of your generational issues, I mean, I think, we're seeing here in the United States, sadly, it hurts me to see such a large amount of Americans that fall for just the simplest, stupidest, and most blatant, false information, oftentimes for tribal political reasons. Like if you hate someone from the other party, you're willing to trust and believe anything that was said about them. We just saw there's a Supreme Court vacancy up, and one party is attacking the other party for being tied to pedophiles and stuff, which is just completely insane, nonsense, and not true. But they know that there's a group of people who live in fear and anger, and this kind of stuff stokes them up for their partisan political purposes. And so, sadly, disinformation works, and therefore it's not going to go away anytime soon.
Well, most of the experts have been saying that Russia can bear the war for as long as 3 months. We are now entering the 3rd month. So in your opinion, what's going to happen in mid-May when Russia doesn't have the strength to keep up with the war?
Well, the one thing that's tough here is Ukraine has done an incredible, brave job of fighting off the Russians and bloodying them and doing a lot here, but they don't necessarily have the means to sort of go on the offensive, to sort of push Russians out of eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. And so it's hard to really predict what's going to happen here. I do think Vladimir Putin, as he is less and less successful, has to try to think of some way to claim victory, maybe by taking the area between Crimea and the Donbass region, or solidifying Donbass and holding it forever or something. But the world outside of Russia sees this person who made their name and their narrative of being this strong man of showing weakness. And that's, we've seen this happen before. I was in Russia in the 1990s when Russia went into Chechnya thinking, there's some leadership there that's talking about independence, we'll just throw them out and put our people in. And the Russians went in and got bloodied and did poorly. And they essentially then went back several years later and, essentially used carpet bombing and killing men, women, children, cows, pigs, and everything, and destroying the entire landscape to try to put in a pro-Russian regional government. And so I think we're still going to see some spasm of killing civilians, of Vladimir Putin showing in his own sad and disgusting way that he can't be pushed around, and his way of doing that is to be violent and murderous. And so I think we're going to see some of that before things settle down and it's clear of where power lies on the battlefield.
Well, John, many thanks for your time. Many thanks for your very precious explanations and from the unique angle that you gave us today. So thanks for making the time to join me today. Thanks everybody for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.